Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my end of the season deep dive series, where I started at the back of the pack and worked my way to the front of the pack, going to a deep dive on each of the teams. And today I will be hitting the top 5, where I start off with Williams in that 5th position. Now we're going to compare that team against the teams around them, so basically the 4th position team and the 3rd position team, as well as the drivers for Williams, and kind of compare those drivers in the Drivers' Championship around where they finished in that Drivers' Championship. So the ones above them and the ones below them as well. Now, as we can dig into the Williams teams, we can see that they moved up quite a bit from last year, from 9th up to 5th place this year, which is a really good run for them. And it's their best results since 2017. Now, with James Vowles coming in and starting to rebuild basically everything from the ground up in that team, trying to get them, coordinated and building on a more, easy basis, getting a consistency and a rhythm going on, getting them really tightened up, that helped them in this regard, I think, and getting those new methods in there that they can keep track of everything. Now, even though they had some decisions that they had to make early on about trying to focus more on the 26 car than this year's car, the 2025 car, seemed to improve that car quite a bit. It had some decent results in this mix, and they were able to, get those cars up on a consistent basis into those points. As we can see that Alex Albon was fairly consistent throughout the whole year, getting, into that top 5 multiple times. And if you look at Carlos Sainz, he had a little bit of trouble adapting to that car early on in the season, but in that second half kind of started getting more in depth with that car and gotten into P3 even in that cutter race. So that was good to see. Now we also see that Sainz brought some experience and some of his past work from the other teams that helped him out in the, designing that car and getting that car, sorted out in that setup phase and getting it to the best that they can do in those situations. The reliability of that car was much improved over the 2024 car, which helped them, get that competitive car from the very beginning and kept it going throughout the season, which helped, and again, get those results throughout the whole season and not just the beginning or the end of the season, as we've seen some other teams too. Now we'll have to see if James Vowles can continue this, progress in 2026 when all the rules change, and see if the adaptation of those rules will help them or hurt them in that regard, as they're still trying to rebuild that team from the ground up to get them to the best possible situation. Now, if we dive into the drivers a little bit, we can look at Sainz. And Sainz out-qualified in the sprint races, Albon 3 out of the 6 times. And he ended up ahead of his teammate in those sprint races only 4 out of the 6 times. So quite a bit better than his teammate in those sprint races in general. If we move over to the GP races, he out-qualified Albon 15 out of the 24 times in those GP qualifying sessions. Now, did he finish up ahead of his teammate in those GP races? Only 9 out of the 24 times. So he dropped back a little bit overall in those full GP races, where those quality points, the majority of the points were in those GP races instead of the sprint races, so that counted a little bit more on regards. But that was a really good effort, and I think you could see that he was coming on in that second half of the season a lot better after he got kind of used to that car and how they were doing things in Williams, and kind of bringing them up to speed on how he would like things done as well. So I think that we'll see that a little bit more next year as they develop that car as well. Now, if you want to do the numbers, I'll do those same thing for Albon. So he out-qualified Sainz 3 out of the 6 times, so half and half. So it was good qualifying sessions, but he kind of dropped back down, as I said, and only outperformed Sainz 2 out of the 6 times in those sprint races. So he only finished ahead of Sainz 2 of those 6 sprint races. So he has a little bit of work to do in those sprint races, but if you go back into the GP races, he out-qualified Sainz 9 out of the 24 times, so not quite even there, but he came back in those finishing positions and finished ahead of Sainz 15 out of the 24 times, so just over half on that regard too. So he kind of pulled himself back in line at those GP races and the full race setups. So it sounds like, Alex needs to work on his qualifying sessions a little bit, and then we need to get that consistency going on the full races to get them the most points that they can, edge out on those cases. And here we have a little chart just kind of giving you an idea of how well the Williams team did overall in this 2025 season, as they moved up from that 9th place from 2024 up to the 5th place this year, or this past year in 2025. They had an average sprint qualifying position of 11.1 and an average finishing sprint race of 11.6. So they dropped back a little bit in those races on average, but we're still getting into that 11th spot, but it's still not quite where they want to be, as that point, a couple places away from those point markers in those sprint races. Now on the GP race front, they averaged qualifying in that 12th position, but moved up to finishing those GP races on average to that 11.6 marker. So just a slightly increase, but they were able to get into the points a little bit more consistent than the teams behind them, which gave them that little extra boost to get into those points on a more consistent basis. And they had 1 sprint DNF and 9 DNFs in those GP races. Now, if we split that down to the drivers to figure out how well each driver did in those situations, we can see that Carlos Sainz went from 5th place last year in the Drivers' Championship down to 9th this year when he switched from that Ferrari team when they kicked him out and moved over to the Williams team. So I still don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, as he's come into a little bit lower team, trying to get them up to speed in this regard. And of course, he had to adjust as well to how that team did things. Now, his average sprint qualifying position was 11.5, so it's a little bit farther back than his teammate, but did actually improve throughout the year. So he ended up on average, those sprint races in 11.3. So not a lot of movement, but still a little positive movement in that regard. Now, if you move over to the GP races, again, it was around in that 11.2 qualifying position. And he dropped down basically 1 spot to that 12.2 on average of those GP races. But again, I think that's, if we look at those graphs a little bit later on, it's mainly in those front runner positions where he lost that bit, where he was still trying to get used to that Williams. And he had that 1 DNF in the sprint race and 5 of those 9 DNFs for the GP races for that team. Now we look at his teammate, Alexander Albon, who started off in 16th last year and moved up to 8th this year in the Drivers' Championship. So that's a good improvement for him, getting back into that Williams, and that Williams growing in consistency and how that can perform, and getting that extra more of that performance out of that Williams. His average sprint qualifying position was 10.7, and he dropped down a little bit in the sprint races down to that 11.8 marker on average. So he's not quite getting all that he can out of that Williams in those sprint races, kind of dropping down a little bit. Now his average qualifying position for the GP races is 12.8, so flew it farther back than his teammate, but he's able to move up overall in those GP races up to that 11th position on average. So not quite where he needs to be in that 10th position to get points on an average basis, but close enough to get there where he can take advantage of the situation and get some points when he can. So that kind of helped out overall. And he had 4 of those DNFs in those GP races for their team. And here we compare the 2 Williams drivers in those 6 sprint races and where they finished up overall. And so you can kind of see here that Carlos was, getting used to that Williams early on. So he had those couple of bad runs, but then was able to come back in, Belgium and Austin and do fairly well. And then that Williams didn't look like it did quite as well as they wanted to in Brazil. And then they came back a little bit in China, but you can kind of see that comparison there on those 2 team members, as it was probably more of a car issue than a driver issue, as they were pretty uniform between Austin, Brazil, and Qatar, and to give you a better feel for how they did against each other. And of course, if you look at those trend line is going down as good in this case, because it means you're finishing farther up in the front. So you want to have that good, nice downward momentum in that trend line. So Carlos is doing fairly good there as he's getting used to that Williams car, whereas Alexander Albon was getting slightly worse. It's probably due to partly the developments and updates for that Williams, as they couldn't provide quite as well as they would have liked. And so he's kind of dropping back slightly in that regard, but still a pretty consistent basis in that 11th position, as we said earlier. So here we're comparing Carlos Sainz against Fernando Alonso and Alexander Albon. So that's what the drivers finished around him in that Drivers' Championship, and looking at those sprint races. So it's just looking at those 6 sprint races. So you kind of see that, Carlos and Alex earlier on just by themselves, but we throw Fernando in the mix in that green and kind of figure out where he is as well. And you can see that Fernando was getting a nice strong pattern, getting better throughout the season in those sprint races with that trend line. Whereas, Alexander Albon was pretty steady and Carlos Sainz was getting better, but not quite as fast as, Fernando Alonso. And you can see that basically because of those three middle races, sprint races for Fernando didn't quite do as well, then came back fairly strong in Brazil and Qatar. And if we're starting to look at, Alexander Albon, of course, we have to still compare Carlos in there because he's right next to Albon in that Drivers' Championship. And so we throw Kimi in the mix as well to, round out those three around Alexander Albon in those 6 sprint races. And so you can kind of see an idea here where Kimi was, doing fairly well at the very beginning and had that bat off in, Belgium, but started coming back again in Austin, Brazil, and Qatar, fairly strong in that regard. So it kind of put him ahead of Alexander Albon in those sprint races and overall points for the Drivers' Championship. And you can see that line was still, again, going downward for Kimi, which is good because he's actually that rookie coming in and learning the ropes in that Mercedes. And so he's getting better throughout this year as well, showing what he can do. And then so you have to compare that in that result. And so this is kind of some general results for those sprint races. Of course, this is just the sprint races, so there's not a whole lot of points regarding these, but there's enough there to make it interesting in regards to that team. So we look at the GP races for the Williams team and the 2 drivers for Williams here, Carlos Sainz and Alexander Albon, and how well they performed in each of those GP races. And we can kind of see what we expected to see here as Carlos was trying to get used to that Williams. So he started off, farther back in that pack, and then as he got more comfortable with that Williams, he got better and better on those performances. And you can see that through that trend line as he started off in that, 14th-ish place and ended up more to that, closer to that 10th marker at the end of the season for that trend line. So he's getting better throughout the season, where Alexander was getting worse throughout the season. He started off strong. It's not doing horribly, but still, getting slightly worse throughout the season, not quite having the time that he would liked at the end of the season with his teammate Carlos in that mix, but still doing, as I said, a fairly good job getting up in those top 5, multiple times throughout the season. He just needs to work, and hopefully they can, develop that car, to make it more consistent across the whole season for him. In that regard, it seems like Carlos was able to take advantage of some of the updates a little bit more than Alexander Albon was, that was developed throughout this year. So we'll have to see how that plays out with the new regulations, of course, next year in the 2026 run. And again, we're looking at Carlos Sainz and comparing to the drivers around him. So that's, Alexander Albon. And then we throw Fernando Alonso in that mix as well in those GP races and kind of compare those 3 drivers as well. So again, you can see Alexander Albon kind of getting worse throughout this year, mainly through the developments of that car, not being able to take full advantage of that. But you can see the nice close range between Carlos Sainz and Alonso in this running, as they both started off fairly poorly, but we're getting better throughout this year with Fernando Alonso getting that edge off of Carlos Sainz in that trend line, getting better a little bit faster than Carlos was, but still doing some good performance and good comparison between those drivers. And of course, it was a kind of a chaotic year as well, and so you see a lot of ups and downs in that mix, which kind of throws and makes things a little bit messy in regard, but you can kind of get an idea of how well they did. And comparing potentially how well the Aston Martin was doing against the Williams car in these races. And here we're looking at Alexander Albon and comparing him against, Carlos Sainz and Kimi Antonelli in those GP races and how well he performed overall. And again, you can dive into a little bit more detail on Kimi here, as he started off pretty parallel to Carlos Sainz in that regard. Not quite getting, the trend line, development that Carlos did, but still getting a pretty good, improvement throughout this year, but ahead of him from the very beginning of the season to the end of the season, getting that better Mercedes car over that Williams car in general to get those results in that setting, but pretty parallel across the board for this season, but comparing those 2 drivers. So we'll have to see how they can compare next year in this 2026 run with those new regulations to see how if they, keep lining up, or if one's going to be able to take advantage of the situation and get, better tweaking in development of that car to get the most out of their car with those new regulations, which probably not going to align perfectly with those drivers' abilities and how they can take drive around that track. Anyway, so you can go look at Albon here. Again, he's going up, as we've seen earlier. So he's kind of getting worse throughout the season. As I said, those developments didn't quite work out as well as he would have liked throughout the season, but we have a brand new regulations in 2026, which will change things quite a bit for him. So hopefully you can take advantage of those. And here we're just comparing the points scored, overall for the two Williams, drivers. And you can see here that Albon, started off the season really strong and kind of kept that pretty consistent for that 2/3 of the season, where he kind of dropped off at the end, where Sainz started off very slowly, and then at the end of the season came back fairly strong, getting some really good results, in those few races at the end of the season, gaining him that ground, pushing him up farther in the Drivers' Championship, and how those trend lines progress. And again, this is the trend line going up now because we want to see more points as the season goes on. So you can see Albon's going down, so he's getting worse throughout the season. Started off strong. By the end of the season, wasn't getting near as many points as he did at the beginning, whereas kind of the opposite of Sainz, where he started off getting a few points, but not quite where he needed to be with his teammate. But by the end of the season, getting really good results, getting that upward momentum on that trend line. And here we see that same data just put into a step graph, so you can kind of get an idea of the ebbs and flows of how the season went and where they were getting closer or farther away from each other. So you can see that, Sainz was getting down there fairly at the bottom until that 2/3 marker-ish, where he started gaining some really good ground on those points, getting closer to his teammate Alexander Albon on those point markers for the Drivers' Championship. And here we're diving into more of the team aspect of it. So these are the points for the teams, and we're looking at Williams, and of course we're comparing them against the Racing Bulls team and the Ferrari team, as they are the ones that finished around them in that constructor standings. And so we kind of look at those points in these sprint races and where they got those points and figure out what those trend lines are in those sprint races, which is kind of interesting to see. Again, it's not the big points, but it is helps edge out some of those areas as well. That keeps it kind of interesting in that regard. We'll have to see how that changes out in the future, but right now it's it's not quite where we wanted it to be, I don't think, to get really excited over those sprint races. But anyway, we see the Williams team getting more ground throughout the season, having that point marker go up throughout the season, where we see the Racing Bulls and Ferrari have a pretty drastic trend line going down, which means they're getting less points as the season progressed. And that's just, of course, again, the sprint races and not the GP races. We'll get into those here in a second. So this is that same data just in a step graph, looking at those points and just for the sprint races here. So we can see that, Racing Bulls started off decently, but didn't really gain much ground from that point forward, where Williams started off poorly and then came back and jumped ahead of the Racing Bulls in those points for the sprint races, where Ferrari was fairly dominant over those teams in general, getting ground throughout the season. And now we dive into the main event, the GP race, is where they get the big points. And so we're comparing those points for each of those teams. And so here again, you can want to have a upward momentum on that trend line, showing that you're getting more points at the end of the season than you are at the beginning of the season. Where here we see, the Williams is pretty steady across the board, they're pretty level. So they're getting roughly the same amount of points at the beginning of the season as they were at the end of the season. Whereas we see the Racing Bulls have a slightly upward trend, so they're getting a little bit more points as the season goes on, but they kept the development of that car, where others maybe stopped the development of their cars or were not able to get the performance out of the updates that they did bring. So that was good for the Racing Bulls. And then, of course, you have Ferrari, getting quite a bit more points overall in general, but having a downward trend line. So they weren't quite getting the points at the end of the season as they were at the very beginning of the season in that regard, but still pretty far ahead of Williams and the Racing Bulls in that regard if you're looking at comparing those teams. And here's that same data just in a step graph format to kind of give you, again, the ebbs and flows of how that season progressed. And again, you can see, that Williams was ahead of the Racing Bulls from the get-go, but just barely throughout the season, keeping ahead of them, on a decent amount, but not really pulling ahead drastically. Like the Ferrari, as it started off fairly poorly, but quickly got their act together and started climbing, getting that gap fairly strong in that mix over the season. Now here's where you pull out your magnifying glass and try to do the memory game here and kind of flip back and forth if you want to go back to the previous graphs, because this is the graph that includes both the sprint races and the GP races and the point markers, and see if anything's changed in regard to that, if how well those sprint races affected the overall season for these teams. And here there's not a whole lot to see. Again, the Williams is pretty constant straight across the board on those trend line, whereas Racing Bulls was going slightly up there, and Ferrari is going down a little bit more than the trend line for Racing Bulls going up, but going worse throughout the season, but still pretty steadily ahead of the Williams and the Racing Bulls teams in regard to points for this season, as they were kind of the back of the pack of that top rung, where Williams was at the top of the rest of the field. And this is how it looks, in that step graph format. So here you can see that Ferrari, even though they didn't start off that great in general, they had a little bit better incline because of those sprint races in that regard at the very beginning. But that gap still, gets relatively big, and no matter what view you're looking at in that regard. And of course, the Williams and the Racing Bulls teams kept basically that same flow. They didn't have anything significant come out because of those sprint races in the mix of the overall point scheme. And since we're at that halfway or just getting into that top 5 marker, I figured I'd throw in a couple of graphs here showing you those mid-team tiers and how well they kind of compare to each other. So we can see here that the Williams in that aqua was the best of the rest, outdoing the Racing Bulls and Aston Martin teams, and the rest of them would fall behind those. Whereas Williams was quite a ways away, but from that Ferrari team, and then where that kind of came in with the Red Bull team, as we'll dive into a little bit more detail and deep dive into those in the coming weeks. But there's a pretty big gap there from those front runner teams. So if you found this kind of interesting and would like to see more of this, I'd appreciate a subscribe, as you'll be hopefully get notified for the next week's dive into Ferrari. And I would appreciate a like on this video as well if you're able to do so. And so until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.